Hey, what's going on, everybody? Back again. Actually, this is gonna be about probably four, 2 to 4 of the CIA's in the Cold Wars, probably two of the most corrupt members of the CIA. One of those people, his name was Edwin Wilson, and the other person was a person named Theodore Shackley. Let me blow these up for you real quick. So Theodore Shackley and Edwin P. Wilson were most likely involved in drug smuggling for or at least with the power of the CIA, even if the CIA weren't entirely aware of what they were doing. But regardless, they were kind of involved in the Golden Triangle heroin smuggling. Um, and there was a big banking scandal in Australia in the 1970s called the Nugan Hand Bank scandal. And I'm going to show a video of that here in a minute. But some other people to talk about are also Thomas G. Kleins. He was an associate of both. This is a photo of Theodore Shackley here. And then also this person here, who is Edwin P. Wilson. So let's go into this real quick.
In recent years, there have been charges from time to time that the CIA has involved itself in illegal activities. Some of the most bizarre to date involve a bank in Australia known as Nugan Hand. And tonight, Gary Shepherd has a report.
When the Nugan Hand Bank of Sydney, Australia collapsed in 1980, it appeared at first glance to be just another bank failure. But after Australian authorities began taking a closer look, they discovered a tangled web of intrigue with all the elements of a best-selling spy novel: a mysterious death, the body later dug up from its grave, illegal currency transactions, big-time drug operations, and the Central Intelligence Agency.
We were to become the paymasters for the CIA around the world. In other words, we were putting ourselves in the position to disperse funds for the CIA to whoever they were directed.
Former bank executive Neil Evans, given immunity from prosecution, agreed to talk about the Nugan Hand operation on Australian television. From his account and others, the bank had its genesis during the Vietnam War. 4 of the original stockholders were Americans who listed their addresses as Air America, Army Post Office, San Francisco. Air America was the CIA airline in Indochina, hauling men and supplies on clandestine missions. And according to former CIA agents, even drugs out of the so-called Golden Triangle, where the borders of Burma, Laos, and Thailand converge. Nugan Hand sent Neil Evans to the Thai city of Chiang Mai, the commercial center of the drug trade. He claims the CIA made millions and used the money to finance some of its secret projects.
The idea was that money would be deposited with the Nugan Hand Bank by the CIA through various channels, and also that the Nugan Hand Bank would be the repository for funds coming in from various CIA enterprises, namely drugs in Thailand, marijuana in particular, and that the Nugan Hand Bank would then be responsible for rerouting that money to an account in America with a New York bank.
Nugan Hand was not your ordinary bank. There were secret numbered accounts, and hardly any of its top people were bankers. Many were American civilians and former high-ranking military officers with ties to U.S. intelligence. When they found the body of Australian businessman Frank Nugan, the bank's chairman, shot to death a few months before the bank went under, they discovered in his pocket the business card of this man, William Colby, former director of the CIA. Nugen's partner was Michael Hand, an American Green Beret who served 2 tours in Vietnam, one of them for the Central Intelligence Agency. He disappeared a short while after the bank collapsed and is now believed to be dead. Australian newspapers reported a connection between Nugen Hand and the U.S. Navy's super-secret intelligence unit known as Task Force 157. Among its top agents, CIA man Edwin Wilson, now under indictment for selling arms and explosives to Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi. And a man named Patry Loomis has also been implicated. He was the apparent CIA Nugen Hand go-between. It was Loomis who helped Wilson recruit a team of Green Berets to train terrorists in Libya. The Nugen Hand affair has caused an uproar in Australia, where authorities are trying to find out what involvement the bank might have had in the 1975 downfall of the Labour Party government. Meanwhile, investigators on 3 continents are attempting to trace $50 million missing from the accounts of depositors, including many Americans. Here in this country, the CIA denies any involvement with drug operations in Indochina, the Nugen Hand Bank itself, or the deaths of the 2 men who ran it. Gary.
So yeah, so as you can see, you saw in that video, there was this bank called the Nugen Hand Bank, which was essentially a drug bank for Air America, a CIA airline that was most likely moving drugs and profits out of the Golden Triangle of Laos, Thailand, and Vietnam, um, which is just crazy to think. So let me see here, and then we go down. These are just some notes I take. So interestingly, is that Edwin Wilson was a contemporary to Theo Ted Shackley, but also another man named Thomas Clines, Richard Secord, who actually got busted in the Iran Contra thing. So Theo Shackley, that Patrice Loomis person they talked about in the video, Thomas Clines, Richard Secord. Interestingly, were also incriminated in a cocaine Bolivia to Miami drug smuggling ring via something called Operation TikToks. Um, and it's interesting that going back to Southeast Asia, let me see here. Theo Shackley was also kind of a part of that Bay of Pigs CIA generation, right? So that's the thing about the Bay of Pigs. A lot of the guys in the Bay of Pigs operation were kind of later on involved potentially in some of this kind of drug smuggling operations of the Cold War period afterwards, right? In the 70s, 80s, etc. And during Vietnam, notably. But in the secret war in Laos, right? So in Laos, right, we actually weren't at war with that country, but the Viet Cong and the Northern Vietnamese were using like trails and stuff to basically get between like the 2 countries. So since we weren't at war with Laos, we had to essentially have a secret war with them. That was pretty much approved by like Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon and all those people, and we were basically just dropping bombs and doing a bunch of war crimes and stuff. But anyways, in that secret war, it was actually being ran by a John Singlob as far as the military goes, and John Singlob was actually featured in a good YouTube series you should check out called Eyes Wide Open. So look that up, Eyes Wide Open. It's a docu series on YouTube that kind of talks about CIA and stuff like that, right? But Singlob was a veteran of the OSS Detachment 202, which included other people like E. Howard Hunt, Paul Helliwell, i.e. the banker of the CIA, Lucien Cognier, or Cognin, who was also kind of in the Vietnam era, but also way back in World War II. He would actually become one of the first directors of the precursor organization of the DEA. So think about that, a CIA guy who becomes the leader of the DEA, who has potential ties and networks and contacts with people who were managing the secret war in Laos, in which a lot of the heroin was coming from, such as like what you see in movies like American Gangster, etc. Right? But regardless, it's just interesting. So we talked about the Nugan Bank, right? But they mentioned this Edwin P. Wilson guy. So who was he? So Edwin Paul Wilson was a former CIA and Office of Naval Intelligence officer who was convicted in 1983 of illegally selling weapons to Libya. It was later found that the U.S. Department of Justice had relied on a false affidavit with prosecuting Wilson. As a result, Wilson's convictions were overturned in 2003 and he was freed the following year. So he was born in Idaho. He went to the University of Portland. He was a Marine, fought in the Korean War, but then he ends up joining the CIA. So then he went to Cornell with the agency paying for him to do that. Let me see here. He worked for the Office of Naval Intelligence, doing a bunch of stuff. Let me see here. So Wilson continued to run the businesses that he had built under the guidance of the CIA, the largest of which was Consultants International. He reportedly amassed a fortune of $20 million through these businesses and continued to offer covert shipping services at the request of the CIA after his official retirement. So Edwin Wilson was kind of known for being like the guy who was really good at setting up front companies. And a lot of these front companies were kind of like always involved in shipping and maritime and trade and stuff like that, right? So, for example, Wilson's most valuable time for the CIA was in the Special Operations Division, setting up front companies like Maritime Consulting Associates and Consultants International, which were used to covertly ship supplies around the world. For example, cargoes included disassembled boats sent to Central Africa, where they were welded together on the shores of Lake Tanganyika and used to intercept Soviet arms being ferried across the lake to rebels in the Congo, arms in Angola, crowd control gear in Chile during their dictatorship, Brazil, and Venezuela, all kinds of equipment for intelligence gathering facilities in Iran, supplies for a group of dissident army officers planning a coup in Indonesia, and barges sent to Vietnam. So he was the guy who could get the product to where it needed to be when it needed to be. So as directors of these firms, which were conducted as legitimate businesses, Wilson began to amass a lot of money, but as a contractor, not an employee. He invested in property around the world. In 1971, after 15 years with the CIA, events that have been disputed ended Wilson's entire career, yada yada. So let me see here. Ended official career, yada yada. So let me go down here, right? So that's the thing, right? So Wilson ends up leaving the CIA, I believe, but he doesn't tell people that he did that, and he's still running his businesses. So in 1971, the CIA's knowledge and approval, Wilson moved to the Office of Naval Intelligence, where he worked full-time for a secret intelligence unit called Task Force 157. Between its inception in 1966 and its termination in 1977, the focus was upon acquiring intelligence on Soviet naval activity. However, the unit's remit was wider and later described as the U.S. military's only network of undercover agents and spies operating aboard using commercial and business cover for their espionage. So at this time, Wilson set up another front company, World Marine Inc., to assist his global logistics. Wilson then retired from ONI in 1976 after events that have been disputed. So after a change in commanders, Wilson reportedly appealed to Admiral Bobby Inman, the director of naval intelligence, offering his influence in Congress to the ONI's budget troubles if he, Wilson, could be made chief of Task Force 157. Allegedly outraged, Inman shut down Task Force 157 altogether and reported Wilson to the FBI. However, other calculations may have been in play. So that's what I'm saying. This Ed Wilson guy, super shady, you know, over here, you know, smuggling drugs potentially, funneling the profits through the Nugan Bank. Um, but he also tried to like kind of bribe this admiral, Bobby Eamon, basically saying that, hey, you know, I can kind of get you your, you know, more congressional budget if you make me the chief of the task force. And that pissed off the admiral, and he reported him to the FBI. However, right, it looks like Wilson continued to run the businesses he had built under the guidance of the CIA, the largest of which was Consultants International. So he amassed a fortune of 20 million, right? So in the 1970s, he became involved in dealings with Libya. Wilson claimed that a higher-ranking CIA official, Theodore Blongo Shackley, asked him to go to Libya to keep an eye on Carlos the Jackal. Yes, the infamous Carlos the Jackal, one of the most wanted people um, in during the Cold War. He was actually kind of like a left-wing terrorist or whatnot. He was like doing a bunch of bombings and everything, right? So the infamous terrorist who was living there at the time, a strict sanctions regime was in place against Libya, and the country was willing to pay a great deal for weapons and materials. Wilson stated he began conducting elaborate dealings in guns and military uniforms where and guns and military uniforms were smuggled into the country. So Wilson also recruited a group of retired Green Berets. So decorated Vietnam veteran Billy Waugh was among them to go to Libya and train its military and officers. So think about that. We have sanctions against Libya, but somehow Edwin Wilson is able to get in there and start doing arms smuggling. But we're also sending Green Berets who are retired of the Vietnam War era, etc., to train the Libyan government. Very interesting. So the Libyans use Wilson's provisions to advance their interests around the world, including training terrorist cells to build explosive devices inside radios. But that's questionable. Let me see here. We'll see. But regardless, he ends up getting in trouble for, let me see here, selling C4. Okay, so one cell trained by Wilson's operatives was the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine under the command of Ahmad Jibril. Jibril was suspected of being behind the bombing of Pan Am 103 in Lockerbie, Scotland in 1988. Very interesting. In 1979, a gun that Wilson had arranged to be delivered to the embassy in Bonn was used to assassinate a prominent dissident. Huh. But anyways, right? So peep this out. What? Wow. So he eventually gets in trouble for the C4 thing, right? But regardless, let's skip down here. He was put on trial 4 separate times. Before he stood trial, several prosecution witnesses died under suspicious circumstances, including Cuban exile Rafael Villaverde, who disappeared in a boating accident near the Bahamas after an explosion on his boat, and former CIA agent Kevin P. McCauley, who had worked for Wilson and blown the whistle to the government. What? Wilson's friend, Ricardo Morales, a longtime nemesis of Villaverde in the Cuban exile community, would die in a bar fight. So that's the thing, right? Some of these Cubans were involved in Operation TikToks, which was trafficking cocaine, but we're saying that Wilson was buddies with Ricardo Morales, one of those people involved in that type of stuff, and he ends up dead. So it's just like the CIA was definitely selling drugs, bro. Like this is wild. And these actually have sources, right? This is crazy. The New York Times. New York Times. What? Key witness in trial of former spy is found dead. No link seen in death of ex-CIA agent arms case. So he gets busted for selling C4 to the Libyans, and all of a sudden, a lot of his friends and buddies who are supposed to testify end up dead. Like, what? Like, this is dangerous stuff. Wilson was found not guilty of trying to hire a group of Cuban exiles to kill Libyan dissident Umar Muyashi. His co-defendant Frank TERPIL never stood trial as he was a fugitive for the rest of his life and died in Cuba in 2016. Jeez, man. What? He was found guilty of exporting guns, yada yada yada. So that's just crazy, right? So let's peep this. There's this good video on Edwin Wilson in a TV show called Betrayal, episode 106, and you can actually watch this on Tubi for free, but it's also on YouTube. So I'm just gonna play some of that.
Ed Wilson was a person who decided to sell out his country to a despotic terrorist for money.
20 years ago, Muammar Gaddafi was the Osama bin Laden of the day, or the Saddam Hussein of the day. He was terrorist number one.
Giving, at the time, the world's worst terrorist 40,000 pounds of plastic explosive was a pretty damn rotten thing to do.
Ed Wilson betrayed not just the United States government, but the entire civilized world.
I don't think Ed Wilson ever really expected anyone at the agency to step forward and say, hey, this guy's one of ours, he's working for us, he's working in the national interest. No matter what the truth was, clearly Ed Wilson had to take the fall for it.
In 1982, after a 3-year manhunt, Edwin P. Wilson was finally arrested. The former CIA operative was caught in a government trap and accused of illegally shipping explosives to Libya, a sworn enemy of the United States. He was also charged with running a terrorist training camp. Was Ed Wilson a traitor who sold his country out? Or, as Wilson continues to claim, a patriot working undercover for America's Central Intelligence Agency? 3 years before Wilson's arrest, 2 former operatives with ties to the CIA advised U.S. authorities of a deadly assassination plot. The informants told government investigators Carol Bruce and Larry Barcella that the mastermind behind the plot was a former CIA agent named Ed Wilson.
He was asking them to assassinate someone on behalf of, we later learned, a dictator, Muammar Gaddafi. He was asking them to kill a dissident who was opposed to Gaddafi, who was living in exile in London at the time, and he was willing to pay them $1 million in Gaddafi's money to do that.
The assassination plot sparked a massive investigation into Ed Wilson's activities in Libya. Were they the actions of a rogue CIA agent, or was Ed Wilson secretly working in Libya for the CIA?
And from that day on, my life became focused entirely on investigating what was this all about. Who was this man? Who was he working for?
Ed Wilson was born in 1928 in Napa, Idaho. Ed was the second of 3 boys and was raised on a small farm during the Depression. His father, who sold and bought cattle, died of cancer when Ed was only 12 years old. Wilson put himself through school and eventually earned a university degree in psychology before joining the Marines in 1953. Wilson served briefly on the Korean Peninsula as the Korean War was winding down. He returned home to the United States and on September 25, 1955, married his girlfriend Barbara Hope Hagen. The following month, Second Lieutenant Ed Wilson was honorably discharged from the Marines. The very next day, Ed Wilson joined the Central Intelligence Agency.
Ed's an interesting guy. Here was this big, strapping, corn-fed, Idaho farm boy. He could basically kick the bejesus out of anybody. He was a bold guy. He was a guy that would basically make a decision and move on it. He was a guy that other guys liked. Big drinker, big, hale and hearty, fellow well met.
Investigators discovered that while at the CIA, Wilson's forte was setting up front companies to support covert operations.
The purpose of which was to ship material to places where theoretically it wasn't supposed to go. Military equipment, rifles, other kinds of weapons.
On the surface, it would look like an independent company. It would look like a company that didn't have any connection with the intelligence community, but in fact, it would.
One of Wilson's front companies was Consultants International. It was from this office building in downtown Washington that Ed Wilson moved supplies for covert CIA operations around the world.
Ed was a consummate businessman, and so he was very good at setting up business deals and maintaining the cover of being a businessman while secretly, working for the agency and servicing its needs. He enjoyed the role. He was very good at it. He made a ton of money at it while he was working for the agency.
After more than 15 years with the CIA, Wilson was recruited to a highly secretive naval intelligence unit called Task Force 157. Here, Wilson continued running front companies for the Navy until he officially retired in 1976.
Then basically, he goes completely private. But guess what? He's still got Consultants International. He isn't sitting there advertising to people that he's no longer got the sanction and connections with the intelligence community, and most people just assumed he still did.
Nobody knew. Ed Wilson went to work every day, went to work at the same place. Nobody knew that this was no longer a Navy operation or a CIA operation or just a private business. It was just business as usual.
When Wilson went freelance, his empire began to steadily grow. Using his network of contacts in the intelligence community, Wilson slid deeper into the world of international arms dealing. With offices and property around the world, Wilson's fortune eventually grew to over $20 million. His country estate in Virginia sat on over 2,000 acres of prime real estate. It was here that Wilson entertained and hosted Washington's power elite.
We certainly, as part of our investigation, learned that he did entertain quite a bit out on his Upperville estate, and that he did maintain friendships, we learned, with some senior people at the CIA with whom he had worked for many years.
In fact, one of Wilson's closest contacts was one of the top spies at the CIA.
One of the people he was connected to was Ted Shackley, who looked as if he was going to be director of the CIA one day. Shackley had formerly run a secret war in Laos, and Wilson had helped him by shipping large quantities of weapons secretly to that location.
All of which had to give other people the impression that he was still one of them, or if not one of them, accepted by them.
At this point, Ed Wilson seems to have crossed a line when he partnered up with former CIA employee Frank TERPIL.
TERPIL and Wilson met socially. They got along like a house of fire. And Wilson learned from TERPIL that TERPIL had recently been to Libya and was well connected, as a consequence, with Libyan intelligence. He knew that they had tons of money from oil to spend. He knew that they were deeply committed to running secret operations, terrorist operations, if you will. And what basically TERPIL said to Wilson is, look, you've got the connections here in the States. You can help me acquire stuff. These guys need explosives. They want explosives. They want guns. They want silencers. They want poison kits. They want detonators. Whatever you can get, we can flog over there, and we can make a fortune. And so they went back and forth, and the deal got underway.
With sanctions in place, selling weapons to Libya was an illegal act. But for Ed Wilson, the potential upside was enormous.
At the time, Libya was considered probably the #1 rogue state in the world. It was the main axis of evil at that time.
The country was ruled by a ruthless dictator, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi.
He was the prime supporter and prime provider of sanctuary and supplies to what were then some of the most violent and vicious terrorist groups operating in the world.
He was also an ally of the Russians. The Russians were trying to cultivate him and had concluded a multi-billion-dollar arms deal with him. So Gaddafi was right up there, close to #1 on the list of targets, intelligence targets for the CIA.
Prosecutors were looking for answers that might explain how a former CIA operative and self-professed patriot could turn his back on America and support one of the most dangerous enemies of the United States. Investigators uncovered a secret deal between Wilson and TERPIL and the Libyans. They began supplying the Libyans with everything from uniforms to parachutes, but that was just the beginning.
Wilson was doing in Libya whatever he could make money at in Libya. He had ended up developing connections with 2 very high-ranking people in the Libyan intelligence service, and the range of services and products that he gave went from the mundane to the murderous.
Wilson was trying to set up what amounted to a Murder Incorporated that would be at the service of private clients, whether it was Gaddafi or the CIA or basically anybody who was willing to pay for it.
As the Justice Department focused their investigation, it became apparent that Wilson's dealings with Libya were far more extensive than they had first imagined.
It became abundantly clear very quickly to us that Wilson was entrenched in Libya, that he was close to Muammar Gaddafi and his royal guard, and that he was actually supplying them with weaponry and with explosives.
Wilson and TERPIL became so trusted that the Libyans requested 500,000 detonators and a staggering amount of plastic explosives known as C4.
C4 is an incredibly powerful plastic explosive. You can mold it, you can shape it. It doesn't basically, certainly back then, didn't set off any detectors. It was very difficult to detect. A fist-sized pound of plastic explosives could blow up a vehicle. So it was something that any terrorist organization would kill to get their hands on.
Allegedly, Wilson purchased the explosives from a contact in California who accepted Wilson's story that he was on assignment for the CIA.
Wilson was very good at duping people. A lot of the people that we originally talked to were positive that he was still with the agency because that's exactly the image that he wanted to portray. 40,000 pounds was, by a factor of 2, 3, 4, the largest non-military shipment of plastic explosives in history. It was huge. The cover story is that they're shipping drilling mud to the Libyan oil fields. And there were still certain things that could be shipped to and from Libya, and stuff to support their oil wells was one of them.
The entire shipment of explosives was put into 5-gallon cans. To conceal the true contents, a thin layer of drilling mud was poured on top.
If you were to pry open the can, you would see drilling mud because there was at least a couple of inches of drilling mud on top of the C4 military plastic explosives that was inside the can. It was 40,000 pounds going on one private chartered aircraft. He arranged to ship it first to Houston, Texas, and from Texas, it was going to be shipped to Libya. The drilling mud was loaded onto the aircraft. The pilot of the plane was under the impression he was going to point A, and in fact, he was diverted to Tripoli when he was already up in the air.
As the investigation gathered momentum, Ed Wilson's associates began to cooperate with the authorities in exchange for immunity.
We returned 2 separate indictments in Washington, D.C. One was for the conspiracy to commit murder of the dissident. The second indictment was a much more comprehensive indictment and dealt with providing terrorist training and special ops training to Libyan soldiers.
Some crazy stuff. Wow. I'll put the link in the text of the video that I'll post. But wow, this crazy. It's a good video. So I kind of give a sneak peek, 14 minutes. But I would say, yeah, definitely check this out. So let me see here. Who else we got? Wow. So Edwin Wilson, and that's just wild, right? He even connects back to this Ricardo Morales Navarrete. So they called him El Mono, was a Cuban exile and agent for the CIA. He worked for the DISIP, or the Venezuelan intelligence, and was an informant for the US FBI, CIA, and DEA. So Morales was born in Havana in 1939. He fled Cuba and came to the United States in 1960. He worked for the US CIA for a period, including a stint in the Congo, where he claimed to have killed hundreds serving as a mercenary. So he also worked in Miami while the CIA was looking to destabilize the Fidel Castro government and took part in the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. A report in the New York Times said that within the CIA, Morales was known for his quick wits and courage. So in 1968, Cuban exile militant Orlando Bosch was arrested for and tried for firing a bazooka at a Polish freighter. Morales, as an informant for the FBI, had infiltrated Bosch's group called Cuban Power, described by the government as a terrorist group. Morales taped his conversations with Bosch and gave him bogus explosives that were used in a bomb placed on a British freight ship. As an FBI informant, Morales was among those who testified against Bosch at the trial, and the recordings of their conversations showed Bosch's knowledge of explosions on board foreign ships. Initially, Morales was among those arrested for the bombings, but was released as an informer. His testimony contributed to Bosch's conviction and imprisonment. Over the years, Morales would also serve as an informant for the CIA and the DEA. But he did a whole bunch of stuff. So let me see here. So let me go here. In 1982, Morales, who had moved back to Miami and was testifying for the government in a narcotics investigation, claimed responsibility for a bombing himself, stating that the men who had planted a bomb worked for him. In a 2006 interview, Bosch stated that before his arrest, he was summoned to Morales' office and offered some money and a chance to leave Venezuela, which he declined. In the same year, Posada Carriles denied involvement in the bombing and claimed Morales was responsible. The case that followed the narcotics investigation in 1982 was thrown out by a judge who stated Morales lacked credibility as a witness. Those charged in the case included Rafael Villaverde, another Cuban exile trained by the CIA. Villaverde disappeared in a boating accident near the Bahamas shortly after his arrest in 1982. And then Morales ends up dying in 1982. So, interesting. So go back to Edwin Wilson. So before Edwin Wilson, so he was put on trial 4 times for this whole kind of like a C4 thing, right? Let me see here. Let me go. But so before he stood trial, several prosecution witnesses died under suspicious circumstances. So that's crazy. So you have these Cubans doing their separate stuff, but they have ties to Edwin Wilson. They're kind of cannibalizing themselves, blowing up stuff, getting into their own terrorist stuff, killing each other off. But they were called up to be witnesses, and then they end up suspiciously dead. So a lot of weird overlap there. And then there's also this Frank TERPIL guy. So it was a CIA agent born, Frank TERPIL, CIA, born in 1939, who was asked to leave the agency for misconduct. He went rogue, going to work for Edwin P. Wilson's operations, supplying arms, bomb making training, and surveillance equipment to numerous regimes. So, wow. So he joined the United States Army at 18 and served for 6 years. His second assignment was at the Army Security Branch in Arlington, Virginia, where he repaired cryptographic equipment. After serving in the Army, TERPIL joined the CIA in 1965, working in the Technical Services Division, which adapted technology and weaponry for covert work. After departing from the CIA, he supplied dictators, including Muammar Gaddafi of Libya and Idi Amin of Uganda. In 1980, a U.S. court indicted him on charges of large-scale illegal arms dealing. Wow. He skipped bail and left the United States. In 1981, he was sentenced in absentia to 53 years imprisonment, with the judge describing his operations as trade in death and destruction. He was also allegedly involved in a plot to assassinate anti-Gaddafi dissenter Umar Muhaishi. However, he was never put on the FBI most wanted list. Interesting. So he moved to Lebanon, offering his services to Yasser Arafat and the PLO. In 1982, journalist David Fanning and director Anthony Thomas produced Frank TERPIL, Confessions of a Dangerous Man, which won the Emmy Award for Best Investigative Documentary. When Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982, he moved to Cuba, and at the time in the dispute with the U.S. and subject to an embargo, TERPIL worked for the General Intelligence Directorate, trying to persuade CIA agents to defect, though he was not ideologically aligned with the government. TERPIL and fugitive Robert Vesco joined forces and offered their network of contacts to the Cuban government. Wow. Jeez. So in the mid 1990s, there was a slight improvement in the relations between the U.S. and Cuba. TERPIL and Vesco were put under house arrest for defrauding Cuba. It was reported that Vesco died in 2007, but TERPIL maintained that Vesco had fled to Sierra Leone. In later years, TERPIL posed as Robert Hunter, an Australian retiree living with a young Cuban wife at the Playas del Este outside Havana. In later years, he was concerned that improving U.S.-Cuban relations might lead to him being deported to the U.S. So in 2015, with his health was bad. One leg and part of the other foot were amputated following complications from diabetes. He is reported to have died of heart failure on 1 March 2016 at the age of 76, 3 weeks before U.S. President Barack Obama was to make the first visit of a U.S. president to neighboring Cuba in 88 years. It has also it has been suggested he faked his own death. Jesus. Wow. Frank Turple. What? So let me see what this is.
We also had, of those detectives, 2 of them were technical electronic surveillance detectives. They had been recording all the conversations that had taken place for the past 3 days in the adjoining room.
You put the liquid into the cooling system. You put it dead right into the top of the radiator. The car went about 40 foot in the air.
In the next door suite were 4 men. 2 of them were undercover detectives for the New York City Police, Jose Rad and Jimmy Rodriguez.
On the day of the arrest, we were all sitting in this room here. I was sitting right in this chair here, and Detective Jose Rad was sitting on the corner right there, and the 2 suspects were sitting at the end of the sofa. It was necessary that I receive a contract from them and that I give them $56,000, which I had in that drawer of that desk right there. And besides that, one of the suspects had a weapon that they were going to lend me so that I may assassinate someone that same evening. The key word was French cruller. And after I had given them the money and they gave me the contract and I received the gun, I came over to the telephone and I dialed 5, which is a blank line. I then ordered coffee, donuts, and a French cruller. At this point, from both doors, the door to my left and the front door, detectives came in with weapons and shotguns and arrested the 2 suspects.
Police! Don't move! Do you understand? That's a shotgun behind your ear, motherfucker.
Unbeknown to the management and any of the hotel guests, the 2 suspects were led in handcuffs across the foyer. Two unmarked police cars were parked on East 57th Street. The suspects were separated and driven under armed guard to Lower Manhattan and the New York criminal courts at 100 Center Street. They were fingerprinted and photographed in the squad room on the 9th floor. In New York police records, they are described as TERPIL, Frank Edward, nickname None, date of birth November the 2nd, 1939, place of birth Brooklyn, New York, height 5'11", weight 215 pounds, hair brown, race white, and Corcola, George Gregory, nickname Gary, date of birth February the 9th, 1941, place of birth Detroit, Michigan, height 5'11", weight 175 pounds, hair blonde, race white. Shortly before midnight on December the 22nd, Frank TERPIL and Gary Corcola were taken from their cells on the ground floor of the New York criminal courts and arraigned before Judge Haft. Bail was opposed by Assistant District Attorney Matthew Crossan.
I opposed bail because we found during our investigation that Frank TERPIL and George Gregory Corcola were major suppliers of weapons and assassination devices to terrorists and terrorist groups all around the world. During the course of our investigation, we obtained irrefutable evidence that they had supplied and attempted to supply to our undercover detectives who were posing as Latin American terrorists a variety of weapons, including 10,000 British machine guns, a silenced sniper rifle, a silenced semi-automatic pistol, poisons, liquid explosives, explosive briefcases, and other devices of a similar nature.
In court, the Honorable James Leff rejected Matthew Crossan's arguments. On the 5th of January 1980, Frank TERPIL and George Gregory Corcola were released on bail after each had forfeited $100,000 surety. 4 months later, Frank TERPIL was arrested a second time and committed to the federal penitentiary in Washington, D.C. TERPIL and a man called Edwin P. Wilson were indicted by the federal authorities in Washington on charges including acting as an agent for a foreign power, to wit, Libya, transportation of explosives in foreign commerce, conspiracy to commit murder. In Washington, a judge once more rejected the prosecutor's appeal and granted bail to Frank TERPIL. With serious charges against him in New York and now in Washington, TERPIL was free again. On September the 5th, 1980, Frank TERPIL and George Gregory Corcola, his co-defendant in New York, slipped out of the country for an undisclosed destination in the Middle East. Corcola was confident enough to travel on his own passport. The New York trial proceeded without them. The prosecution case was based on evidence obtained in a massive undercover operation. Detectives Rodriguez and Rod had originally followed a tip-off from a man who was involved with the suspects in an illegal arms deal. The two Spanish-speaking detectives were simply substituted for South American buyers that TERPIL and Corcola were expecting.
On the 15th of November 1979, the case started. Jose was to portray the big boss. We used the name Patron to identify him. I was the person who would actually do the talking for Jose, since he would be playing the character of a person who didn't speak any English at all. And I would not only translate, but since I have some knowledge of weapons, my own background and my police experience, I would also be the weapons expert. After we met Gary Corcola for the first time. He started to explain to us what weapons were available. He inquired whether we were an army or a terrorist group. I made it quite clear that we were a terrorist group. And then we started discussing weapons that would be utilized in a terrorist-type organization.
The first thing that Corcola sold to the undercover detectives was this silenced .22 caliber assassination pistol. The entire silver part of the barrel is a silencer. They were offering this particular weapon to our undercovers as an example of the type and quality of silencer that they could provide in quantities of up to 10,000 lots. The second weapon that Corcola and TERPIL sold to the undercover detectives was this .22 caliber silenced sniper rifle, which they specially manufacture. The entire barrel of this weapon is a silencer from just below the sight where I'm pointing to the end. This is fitted with an aim point electronic sight. This allows the person who is firing the weapon to keep both eyes open, watching the target at which he's shooting. This weapon and the
Ruger that I just showed you were each sold for $1,500. Also at the second meeting, Mr. Cork was sold to the undercover detectives for $800. This bottle of strychnine poison, he said, has the capacity to kill 25 people. It is so powerful that individuals poisoned by strychnine have been known to die in a convulsion so strong that only the top of their head and their heel is touching the ground at the time of death. The body is arched completely off the ground.
The suspects apparently offered their clients a veritable arsenal of terrorist weaponry. This is Corkula's demonstration model exploding briefcase. TERPIL's forte was special purpose weaponry, including a pen that fires a poison dart through a Teflon barrel, which TERPIL particularly recommended for assassinations in aeroplanes.
He described the manner in which you would do it, that being that you would walk down the aisle of the plane next to the person you intended to assassinate. And as you came next to him, fire the poison dart right behind his ear, striking either the carotid artery or the jugular vein. And then go back to your seat and sit down.
The second special purpose weapon combines a cigarette lighter and a pen which fires a .22 caliber bullet. The pen acts as a barrel, the bullet and cocking mechanism are in the lighter. But perhaps the most lethal product in TERPIL's arsenal was binary liquid explosive.
And these are the bottles given by TERPIL to the undercover detective. Each of the parts is relatively stable when separate, but when mixed together forms a liquid that is an explosive 3 to 4 times as powerful as ordinary dynamite. He described one particular occasion in which he drained the radiator of an automobile and filled it with binary explosive.
His eyes would light up as he described how you fill up the whole radiator. And then you just need a detonator and you watch the car go up in the air and little bits were the only thing left over.
He also described blowing up the lobby of a hotel in the Middle East by pouring binary liquid explosive in the earth in a potted plant in the lobby.
He says, "Oh, it's great, Jimmy, it's great." He says, "You take a flower pot. We did this in the Middle East. And you put the 1 part liquid, and then you wait a week, and you put the 2nd part. And then the 3rd time you come over and you put the detonant." The whole hotel went up in the air. And when he described these things, he very excited about it. And he kept apologizing that he didn't have a camera to film it. He says, I couldn't film it, but it was great to see. I stood on the corner and watched it. At that point, I realized I was dealing with a maniac.
Rodriguez was also dealing with a man who had powerful contacts. The prosecutor
Wow, that is some heavy stuff right there. That is heavy. Wow. So let me see what else we got here. Richard Secord.
This incredible outpouring of grief. It's like this human symphony. I'll never forget it. It'll be with me to my grave, the sound of that. It's all I can hear when I look at this picture. It was just awful.
In early 2003, photojournalist Philip Blenkinsop made a tragic discovery in the middle of the jungle, stumbling upon the CIA's long-abandoned secret army in the Xaizambun Special Zone of Laos.
We were the first white faces that these people had seen since they were abandoned by the Americans. They thought that those days of living in fear and being on the run had finished.
12,000 veteran fighters. Their women and children had been clashing with Laotian communist troops for the last 30 years. Now, they want out.
That all we want in Laos is peace, not war. As far as American manpower in Laos is concerned, there are none there at the present time on a combat basis.
Laos is the most intensely bombed country in the history of air war.
I honestly believe that we're trying to free people.
We came from the sky and destroyed everything they owned, everything they loved, everything they held dear. Laos in the 1960s and 1970s became the progenitor for warfare in the 21st century. You want to know how wars are going to be fought in the rest of the 21st century? Look back at Laos.
From 1960 to 1975, the CIA ran a clandestine sideshow to the Vietnam War in Laos. Long Cheng, a remote Laotian valley, became the agency's headquarters and the world's busiest airport, but was never marked on any map.
Long Cheng was a very secret base, and nobody knew about it. Nobody. Now, I don't even believe Congress knew about it at the time.
More than 400 flights a day took off from Long Cheng, and the secret war grew into the largest operation in CIA history. For nearly 20 years, the Lao People's Democratic Republic isolated itself from the outside world after the war. All these years, the mountainous country kept its secrets. Laos is the only landlocked country in Southeast Asia. Due to its strategic location, Laos was used as a pawn in the strategic games between neighboring states, and more recently, between world powers. More bombs were dropped on the Plain of Jars in northern Laos than anywhere else on Earth. Before the war, some 50,000 people lived here. Many of them were members of the Hmong people, an ethnic hill tribe. According to ancient local legend, these jars were created by a race of giants who used them to brew rice wine for the celebration of an arduous but victorious battle. Decampment. The trail of the secret war leads into the Xaizambun Special Zone. Inside the zone lies the former CIA airbase of Long Cheng. This is our destination.
We head now to Xaizambun, the special zone. Why they call special zone? Because it means like the government have to take care special because they have problems with the unorganized terrorism or robber attack the road, and also the government put a lot of armies around, many army camp, you know. I don't know them, but I know their boss.
Susat Petrasi is a well-connected man, and will take us into Longcheng. No outsiders have managed to reach the secret base since the end of the war in 1975. We passed the checkpoint unsearched. In the area, the scars of war are visible everywhere. Cluster bomb casings are used to support houses. Entire villages are built from war scrap.
Soon you'll be on the
40 years ago, Fred Branfman came to Laos as a humanitarian aid worker. Today, he returns to the place that changed his life forever, Tat Luang Pagoda.
When I pulled up to the pagoda, I would say I was just a kind of careless adventurer. No particular goal in life. I went into that pagoda, I talked to those people, and 1 hour later, I was a completely different person than the fellow who had entered the pagoda. And there were thousands of refugees just living like animals on the floor. And I walked up to the first one and we started talking, and he mentioned that he'd been bombed. I wouldn't have even thought to ask him. And I remember that I was in complete shock. Oh my God, I never heard of this, and I'm living in Laos. And I realized that no one else outside of Laos had heard of this. There had been secret bombing going on for 5 years that had killed thousands of people, driven whole populations on the ground, and no one even knew about it. Crazy because I didn't have a moral framework, a conceptual framework into which this fit. You know, you read about something like this, you know that terrible things happen in the world, but when you're seeing it with your own eyes, and it's people that you like, people that you don't want to see them die, there's an element of almost craziness that starts to arise, you know. This is the only eyewitness account of the massacres, the mass murder of civilians that occurred on the plain of jars as a result of the air war. Without these drawings, there would be no record other than, of course, the testimony of the people, but it's these drawings and the essays they wrote to accompany them that tells us what it was like to live under an air war, what it was like to see your beloved grandmother burned alive before your eyes.
The stories of the refugees touched a nerve in Branfman, and he wanted to learn more about the secret bombing campaign. With his Lao friend Nung, he rode out to this refugee camp almost every day. 30 years later, the camp has turned into a village, and most of the former refugees still live here.
Oh, it's a relative of his wife.
Reconnaissance flights are being conducted. In fact, the U.S. Air Force was dropping bombs every 8 minutes. When the fighter bombers couldn't reach their targets over Vietnam, they dumped their bombs on Laos because they couldn't land with bombs on board.
ยินเสียงแล้วพอดีมอบอยู่มีแต่
some wild stuff. So I'll also put the link to that documentary as well into the text when I post this video. Wow, pretty crazy. And then what else we got here? So this is Bang Pao. Bang Pao was the leader of the Hmong people who worked with the United States and the CIA. And some people suspected him of also engaging in drug dealing with the CIA. So what we got here? Thomas. Alright, peep this. Alright. So actually, we were talking about the Edwin Wilson guy. I think we go back here to Theodore Shackley, who was involved in this stuff, right? So it's interesting that Theodore Shackley, some people call the Phoenix program like a serial killer program, because essentially it was like a terror campaign by the CIA, in which they would basically have like terror squads to go hunt for suspected communists, but most of the times there was like war crimes, things got out of control. But anyways, Theodore Shackley, who was working with Edwin Wilson, according to this article on Wikipedia, in 1966, Shackley moved on to the Vietnam War, becoming a CIA station chief in Laos between 1966 and 1968, where he directed the CIA's secret war against the northern Vietnamese forces. He helped coordinate local army efforts against the Pathet Lao in the northern Vietnamese army. Let me see here. So in 1968, he then moved to Saigon to become a station chief for Vietnam. Shackley was responsible for running the Phoenix program in the provincial reconnaissance units, a secret assassination and capture campaign aimed at members of the Viet Cong infrastructure. However, in his memoir, Shackley claimed that he had not been the mastermind of the Phoenix program, which had already started before his arrival in Saigon, and did not even approve of it, given its disappointing effectivity at producing intelligence material and its poor press image of being an assassination program rather than one of information procurement. In November 1969, he decided a 6 month phase out of the CIA's involvement in the program before transitioning it under South Vietnamese control, CIA agents being replaced by CORDS personnel. CORDS was a pacification program of the government of South Vietnam and the United States during the Vietnam War. The program was created on 9 May 1967 and included military and civilian components of both governments. Shackley served in South Vietnam through February 1972 when he returned to Langley, Virginia. According to Thomas Bodenheimer and Robert Gould, Shackley was linked to Australian Nugan Bank, where heroin trade profits worth millions of dollars were transferred after the fall of Saigon. He also ends up, this Theodore Shackley guy, in Chile, in which the United States, with Augusto Pinochet, overthrew the democratically elected leader Salvador Allende. Wow, Thomas Bodenheimer. What is this guy, CIA or Hmm. Wow. Wow. So in May 1976, Shackley was made Associate Deputy Director of Operations, serving under CIA Director George H.W. Bush. After Jimmy Carter had succeeded Gerald Ford as president and replaced Bush with Stansfield Turner, Shackley was relieved of his post in December 1977 before officially retiring from the organization in 1979 when the Carter administration announced wide cuts in the CIA's network of officers and informants. Reportedly, he was forced out of the CIA by Turner, who disapproved of Shackley's involvement with former officer Edwin P. Wilson, who was under a federal investigation for smuggling explosives to Libya. Shackley was suspected by federal prosecutor Lawrence Barcella, who I believe is the guy in that documentary I shared with you, to be part of Wilson's Egyptian American Transport and Services Corporation, a front for his arms smuggling, which was also accused of fraudulently billing the Department of Defense. At that time, Shackley claimed that he would become a CIA director if President Gerald Ford had been reelected in 1976, and only that his investigation kept him from becoming CIA director. Under the new president, Ronald Reagan. In 1982, Wilson was convicted of selling 22 C4 plastic explosives to Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. Wow. Shackley was also involved in the Iran Contra affair. Wow. So that's the thing about these CIA guys. A lot of them were started off kind of in the Bay of Pigs, Cuban Missile Crisis era. Well, most of them were World War II veterans with the OSS, all that type of stuff, right? And then they were kind of got their salts in the early overthrows of like Guatemala, Iran, but a lot of them were later alumni of the Bay of Pigs invasion and the Cuban Missile Crisis. You'll notice a lot of prominent names of the Cold War era were these kind of this class of CIA officers. So basically, all the way from, you can think of like the Bay of Pigs all the way up to Iran Contra, and Iran Contra kind of sealed the fate of like a lot of this era of CIA operatives. Yeah. But then we have another person here. We got John K. Singlob. So John K. Singlob, interestingly, was in the United States Army. He's actually one of the founders of the CIA himself, kind of more so from your special operations operator sort of standpoint, but he was also over there. So John K. Singlob was a major general in the United States Army, founding member of the CIA, and a highly decorated officer in the former OSS. In 1977, Singlob was relieved of his position as Chief of Staff of U.S. forces in South Korea after criticizing President Jimmy Carter's proposal to withdraw U.S. troops from the Korean Peninsula in an interview with the Washington Post. Less than a year later, Singlob was forced to retire after publicly questioning President Carter's national security policies. In 1979, Singlob founded the Western Goals Foundation, a private intelligence network that was implicated for supplying weapons to the Contras during the Iran-Contra affair. Singlob contributed to several books and wrote an autobiography. So I want to say, here we go. So after his time in Korea, Singlob headed CIA operations in post-war Manchuria during the Chinese Communist Revolution, managed the secret war along the Ho Chi Minh Trail in the Kingdom of Laos and Vietnam, worked with the Contras in Nicaragua, and Afghanistan resistance during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. So think about that. China Golden Triangle, Afghanistan. What do they have in common? Heroin. Wow, it's just, and then what we got here, let's see here.
nhớ trong giấy cho nên chỉ cái tên trả thế trong phim mà cho lên cho tụng nó cũng giờ Richard bảo là so sự nhớ trong nó cũng cho nên một sai cũng
Major General Richard Vernon Secord, retired, born July 6, 1932, is a United States Air Force officer with a notable career in covert operations. Aviation detachment sent to the Vietnam War in August 1961, Operation Farm Gate. Afterwards, he returned to Southeast Asia, being detailed to the Central Intelligence Agency for duty in the secret war in Laos. Both of these came about because of his responsibilities for overseeing the operations of the Royal Lao Air Force, Air America, and Raven FACS. After his Southeast Asian service, Secord commanded the 603rd Special Operations Squadron and underwent further advanced military education at the Naval War College. He then served on staff duty in the Department of Defense from June 1972 through September 1975. After his retirement from the U.S. Air Force, Secord went into business. However, he did not immediately sever his connections to covert operations. In latter years, Richard Secord has served as president of a charitable organization, the Air Commando Association.
So yeah, this Richard Secord guy is important because he possibly has some connections to Theodore Shackley, therefore Edwin Wilson, during the whole secret war in Laos, drug smuggling stuff. But he was also caught up in Iran Contra. For example, Operation Tipped Kettle was a precursor to Iran Contra logistics operations. Sources are not explicit about the dates of Secord's involvement, but it seems he may have carried over this project from his military service into his retirement. Operation Tipped Kettle transferred Palestinian Liberation Organization weapons seized by Israel and Lebanon to the Contras. To stay active during retirement, Secord went into business with Albert Hakim, president of the Stanford Technology Trading Group International, also known as the quote-unquote Enterprise, a company involved with arms sales to Iran during the Reagan presidency. The final report of Iran Contra independent counsel Lawrence Walsh concluded that Secord had received at least $2 million for his involvement in these activities and had lied to Congress about it. Wow. It's all connected, man. So Frank Turpel, Theo Shackley, Thomas Clines, Robert Secord, John K. Singlaub, the war in Laos, connections to the Cubans, even from the Bay of Pigs, and all their stuff. Rafael Villaverde, Frank Castro, who else we got here? Operation TikToks. Ricardo Morales Navarrete, Orlando Bosch, some more of the Cubans and stuff like that. So it's a lot of this stuff overlaps, man. It's a dangerous world. Killers, drug smugglers, assassins, hitmen, to the highest bidder, depending on what government wants them. All right, so this is Thomas Gregory Clines, who was also in the circles of Secord, Wilson, and Shackley, and therefore Frank Turpel, most likely, I believe. Let me see here. So Thomas Gregory Clines was an American covert operations officer for the CIA and a prominent figure in Iran Contra. So he served in the Korean War, yada yada. So he worked for the CIA's Technical Services Division in Frankfurt in the 50s as a CIA agent between 1961 and 62. Clines was involved in covert operations in Cuba. So Clines later joined Ted Shackley, David Atlee Phillips, and David Sanchez Morales at JM Wave, the CIA's operational headquarters in Miami, for the Cuban Project, also known as Operation Mongoose, a project to overthrow the government of Fidel Castro. And JM Wave is interesting because JM is a CIA cryptograph. In other words, there was like a bunch of other JM stuff, but JM Wave was like the kind of coordinating center for like the Bay of Pigs and like Operation Mongoose, and it was actually located on property owned by the University of Miami. So during this period, shortly after 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion, Clines developed a personal relationship with Nicaraguan President Anastasio Somoza Debayao after his father, Anastasio Somoza Garcia, allowed the CIA to train anti-Cuban rebels in the country. So between 1966 and 70, during the Vietnam War, Clines worked as Ted Shackley's deputy in charge of CIA secret war in Laos. He also spent time in Chile, where he helped Augusto Pinochet overthrow Salvador Allende. Like, wow. So after the CIA, so he left the CIA in 1978 and joined other ex-CIA officials and contract operatives, including Rafael Quintero. So don't you notice a lot of Spanish, a lot of Cuban type names? Yep, another Cuban. Rafael Quintero, could add him to the list. Ted Shackley, and Ricardo Chavez. Not this one, obviously. In establishing API distributors. In 1979, Kleins established International Research and Trade Limited in Bermuda. Later that year, he worked with Hussein Salem to provide Egypt with U.S. military hardware. He made illicit millions through the Egyptian American Transport and Services Corporation, but in prosecuting Edwin P. Wilson, the U.S. government made a plea bargain that enabled him to escape prosecution, though he had to pay $100,000 to settle civil claims. He was also involved in Iran Contra, so Kleins, as well as Oliver North, Edwin Wilson, and Richard Secord were involved in the conspiracy to provide arms to the Contras, and Kleins himself as a key player in the web of business operations founded by Secord and Iranian arms dealer Albert Hakim. Wow. He's referenced in a book called The Mafia, CIA, and George Bush in 1992. Wow. So I'll probably just wrap that up, but some good stuff. So Edwin Wilson, Theodore Shackley, Thomas Kleins, Richard Secord, I think I already said Edwin Wilson, John K. Singlob, Frank TERPIL. So yeah, just a lot of these, like all the way from the Bay of Pigs to Iran, Contra, to the secret war in Laos, to drug money banks. I mean, it's a wild, wild web that is woven here. So I'm just going to end it right there. All right, take care. All right, bye. Oh, actually, no. One more thing. So this is actually an article about Operation TikTok, which includes some of those Cuban Bay of Pig alumnus or whatever, alumni. Let's see here. So police smashed a white-collar cocaine network Wednesday in the second major crackdown on Miami drug operations in many days. This is from August 5th, 1981. More than 100 persons were being rounded up, and authorities said the crackdowns could have a telling effect on drug trafficking through Miami, one major East Coast pipelines. The FBI Tuesday broke a money laundering operation that allegedly washed $200 million in drug money. Miami police followed up Wednesday with the smashing of the cocaine ring. The roundup of suspects included 61 allegedly involved in the laundering operation and another 51 linked to the cocaine ring. Miami police coded their cocaine crackdown operation TikToks because of electronic listening device placed behind a clock in a suspect's home helped break the case. The FBI called its money laundering probe Operation Banco Shares. It was a classic sting operation in which undercover agents penetrated big-time drug networks by setting up a bogus money laundering operation. An FBI spokesperson said it was the first FBI operation ever directly targeted on laundering of drug profits. Wow. So it's almost kind of like the FBI had to start cracking down on this Medusa that the CIA ironically kind of let out the bag from all of its sort of black market dealings. Like I said, ranging all the way back from the Bay of Pigs, all the way through the Cold War, and all the drug and black market money that it needed to fund its clandestine operations across the world, all the way from Bay of Pigs to the Vietnam War to Laos, Ho Chi Minh Trail. It goes on and on. Eastern Europe, Libya, the Middle East, etc. Wow. One of those arrested was Rafael Villaverde, director of the Little Havana Community Center. So Villaverde said he had been trained in covert activities by the CIA in preparing for Bay of Pigs, as well as were all the members of the Bay of Pigs invasion force. Wow. So now, wow, I'll end that there. All right. Thank you. All right. Take care. Bye.